just by the nature of how we collected the research, we were able to compare and contrast groups. And so that gave us the ability to highlight a few of the disconnects that came out. So in terms of the perception of the representation of communities. So we asked job seekers and those who are currently employed, as well as employers, to reflect on the representation of diversity within the employment setting. And when 49% of the job seekers agreed or strongly agreed that employers in their area did indeed represent the community's diversity. So it's not that that's necessarily a bad percentage, but it's not in alignment with the perception of employers. When we asked a similar question to employers said 82% of them agreed or strongly agreed that the diversity within their organization did in fact represent the diversity within the larger population or their community at large. And so employers thought they were doing a really good job representing the diversity that was there, but job seekers didn't necessarily have that favorable of a agreement with them. Interestingly enough, those who were currently employed fell somewhere in the middle between these groups. We also asked...
Cassie, I'll just jump in really.
Yeah.
I just was going to jump in really quickly there, because in terms of a disconnect, what really jumped out here was the invisibility of people that were having challenges getting to work. So I remember being in one of the communities myself, and employers saying, oh, there's nobody in this. We tried to have a diversity committee. There's nobody in this community that isn't represented in the workplace. And so we were, talking about people with mobility challenges and stuff like that. Oh, there isn't anyone like that here. We had personally seen somebody on the street in a wheelchair, and they just weren't noticing them. And worse than that, many of the folks that couldn't get around were really just at home, and they weren't visible in the community because they couldn't get to the stores or they couldn't get to the workplace. So the employers probably aren't wrong in the sense that they believe that what they're seeing in the community is represented in their workplace, but the folks that are looking for work are saying, hey, I don't see me represented in the workplaces. I don't see someone like me, because they're not able to access it. So I thought that was an interesting piece of that disconnect.
Yeah, and I think to add to that too, Roberta, is the notion about, someone in a wheelchair with a very visible condition. It's easy to say it's present or it's not present, but we know that there's a lot of neurotypical type conditions that just are not visible. That people wouldn't know of. Even chronic illness and disease could certainly require some level of accommodation within organizations. And when it's not visible or you don't know, you don't see it and you think that it doesn't exist. And so that goes back to our previous slide. One of the things was awareness. That was another thing that came up over and over again.
You just mentioned in the chat, sorry to talk over you, but it's really easy for employers to ignore. And we'll talk later about, we just don't know what we don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of welcoming spaces, we had all these tasks that we asked both job seekers and those currently employed as well as employers. We asked them to rank how easy or challenging these tasks were. And so one of those for employers, we asked them to rate how difficult was this task providing a welcoming space within the existing workplace environment. And most employers ranked this as one of their top 3 easiest tasks, that it was very easy to create these welcoming spaces. But job seekers ranked feeling valued or welcomed within those very same workspaces one of the most difficult tasks. So it's interesting to see that, job seekers who maybe were struggling to attach and maintain employment were actually not feeling welcomed or valued within those spaces. But employers were saying, oh, it's very easy to have people stay and be welcomed and valued. And that's not something that they struggled doing. So that was another one of the disconnects that we identified. And as Roberta mentioned, and we sort of spoke about briefly, was this notion about transportation as a barrier. And so within the interviews and the focus groups that we did, transportation came up over and over and over again within individual responses or individuals who are working within community service centers or other community groups. Transportation was just high on everyone's list. And there were some really interesting ideas that came out, unique ways that we could overcome this transportation challenge, this barrier that they had identified. But when we spoke to employers, nobody self-identified that as something that was necessary or that constrained or facilitated the employment success of people. And, you know, as we've had these conversations talking about the research and the diversity disconnects, we've seen employers say, oh, yeah, that makes sense. But when we had open-ended conversations with them, it didn't sort of come up by itself. So one of the things I want to reinforce with this particular research was, again, it's based in BC. It's based within these small communities that we looked at. It looked at Indigenous representation. It looked at having representation from individuals with differences of abilities, but it didn't specifically go out and look for French or Francophone input. And so Yves has come on for this project. And I wondered, did you have anything in terms of the diversity disconnects or any of the success factors that came out of the research that highlights as important for you that we should consider within the French context?
Well, the first part is that there's a lot of similarities. If you're in a rural context, you know, limited transportation is the same and so on. But you know, a couple of things to consider. If you're a Francophone living in a minority situation, for example, here in BC or in Ontario or Manitoba, then you know you have access to different connections and different areas of collaboration because there's kind of a network that's been built within the minority Francophone community. And that's actually a success factor to be connected within that community to speak French. If you happen to be a newcomer in Quebec and you didn't necessarily master French when you arrived in Quebec, then French is an obstacle because the parts of the states that are supporting you learning French are not quite adequate. And then, you know, the people who are supporting you in accessing employment realize that, you know, one of the additional barriers is you haven't completely mastered French yet. So, you know, it's interesting that depending where you are in the country, you know, trying to access employment and having French as your first language or as your the official language of Canada you're more comfortable with makes a big difference. So there you go.
Thanks. I imagine that language would also be a consideration for newcomers or refugees in our communities as well, who maybe aren't always necessarily settling within rural and remote spaces because the access to, you know, landing services and things like that aren't in those spaces as well.
Yep.
Thank you. Excellent. So we want to turn our attention to a few of the frameworks and models that will help us contextualize these results. So I'm going to turn it over to Roberta.
Thanks, Cassie. And I mentioned before that we were going to introduce a model that in part explains what's going on with this disconnect. And so many of you will be familiar with the Johari window or a similar diagram that talks about blind spots. And the thing with this model is that we all start by not knowing what we don't know. And in fact, that's a pretty comfortable place to be, because if we don't know that we don't know something, we actually think that we know something. And so we're quite comfortable. There's nothing disturbing us. So that's like employers saying transportation is not an issue. They're blind to it. They don't see it as an issue. Nobody has brought it up to them as an issue. So unconscious incompetence is not an uncomfortable place to be. And therefore, we're not working too hard to get out of it, right? We don't have any motivation or any impetus to change because we don't think there's a problem. But then something nudges us into conscious incompetence where we're aware now that we've been doing something wrong or not as well as we could do it, or that we don't know something. And that conscious incompetence stage is a horrible stage to be in. It's really uncomfortable. Nobody wants to be embarrassed. Nobody wants to be put on the spot. Nobody wants to have to, look at their past actions or decisions and, feel shame over them or be embarrassed. And so our natural instinct in conscious incompetence is to get defensive and to say, well, it's really not a problem, or it's not as big of a problem as people are saying, or I did the best I could. But if we can push through that conscious incompetence, that stage where we're aware now that there's something that we need to learn. And I think Janet introduced that so beautifully on the safety slide, that we're all learning. I'm learning every day. And so people need to point out for us where a change needs to happen that moves us into conscious incompetence. And then we have to put some effort into learning something new. And that moves us into the conscious competence stage. But if you can think about anything that you've had to do for the first time. I had to drop some grandchildren off at school yesterday for the first time, and I made 2 wrong turns on the way there. And today I was so proud that I made those 2 right turns that are correct turns, that I actually then missed the whole school. I missed the destination, and I have these little voices in the back saying, did you miss the school? So conscious competence is an awkward stage. We're learning, we haven't mastered it yet. We need to be open to feedback and correction. And that's why there's such an important emphasis on ongoing professional development, like being in a webinar like this series, seeking supervision, being really honest with our supervisor rather than trying to just show up looking good for our supervisor, saying, hey, this is what I'm just struggling with. And also seeking out consultation from people that already have mastered that particular competency and can help us move forward. And with that effort, we'll eventually move into unconscious competence. And so we're comfortable there. We've integrated it into our way of being and doing. But that's also a dangerous place to be, because when we're unconsciously competent, we're not even aware of what we're doing. So it's difficult to transfer that knowledge to other people. We just, again, my stepson said to drop the kids off at school, you just stay on this one street. Well, this one street actually has 2 significant turns on it. The street name is the same, but it's not marked at all that you have to make those turns in order to get there. So unconscious competence is often the place that the leaders and supervisors are at, and it's difficult for them to articulate what you would need to do in order to master this. So we wanted to introduce this particular model just to help you think about the complexity of the challenges that people are facing, and to explain in part why the disconnect is there. We didn't speak to anybody who didn't want to make things better. Every single person was committed to making the world a better place, especially for people with employment disadvantages, but they just weren't aware of where those changes needed to happen or how to make those changes. So I'm going to turn it back to Cassie to talk about the complexity of our sector, which further exacerbates this problem.
Yes, thanks, Roberta. So I wanted to share this graphic from Challenge Factory. They did some research in 2024, or published some research in 2024 regarding our sector. So they created this scoping model, and I fully recognize there's a lot of teeny tiny little print on here. So the source that we've referenced here will be something that you can go to afterwards to review in further detail. But essentially what it's trying to do is describe and illustrate who is in this career development ecosystem, because we all sort of play different roles. And those roles sometimes are really evident and obvious and visible to others. And there's a whole bunch of people doing career work sort of under the surface. So the visual metaphor that they went with here, which I think really explains the career development sector very well, is an iceberg. So we know that the tip of the iceberg is what's really obvious, that we can see, it's visible, it's present, but there's just so much below the surface that extends the sector. And that's the very same way with the iceberg. There's all this space under there as well. And so if you look in sort of the center piece where they've got those 2 big blue boxes and then some more details down below, there's essentially 2 sides of this. On the left side, they're describing organizations that are part of this career development sector. And on the left side is the organizations. The right side is the members, the individual members, and they utilized these personas to describe essentially composite roles and responsibilities that exist in those spaces. So the really obvious member organizations are career and employment service providers. Many of you on the call here today are from career and employment service providers, or within post-secondary or other types of educational institutions. Those are the really obvious ones. And the roles that people might play there are practitioners, so career development practitioners, maybe they're directors, career educators, instructors, or even parents offering career advice, playing an influential role in terms of the career practice. And so those are kind of the obvious ones. But when we look down below, we've got community and social support groups, we've got Indigenous service providers, employers, recruitment, outplacement, other associations that serve the industry, and researchers and policy influencers are also there, along with funders and different policymakers. And so in each of those spaces, there's people playing unique and distinct roles there as well. And so that's sort of the first layer along this iceberg imagery, is the organizations and the individuals that exist there. And when we have those organizations and individuals working in harmony together, essentially this model is presenting the ability for there to be intergenerational, positive, ongoing interactions and change for all of these different places. So you'll see those big arrows on the side. We've got, the funders working on systems change, working on supporting a culture of career development. And you've got more of the practitioners or individual service providers at the top, focusing on behavioral change, which is really working with individuals. You'll also see a line here about direct engagement with Canadians and indirect engagement with Canadians. That's sort of under the surface there as well. And that's just talking about direct services being like you're working face-to-face with somebody. And if you're under the surface of the iceberg, so if you're under the water, but you're still providing direct services to Canadians, you may not necessarily even see yourself as part of the career development ecosystem. So employers, or we might have people like talent managers or recruiters who are doing career work. They're influencing employment experiences in rural and remote spaces for individuals who are underrepresented. They're playing a role providing direct services, but they may not necessarily see themselves as career development influencers. So that's something that we're really wanting to expand the notion of who is in this space, and this model does a really good job of it. Now, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that came along with this work, which I won't get into today, but I do encourage you to take a look at that report. It's full of a wealth of information and resources for people who may or may not see themselves in career practice or trying to advance the field forward. So Roberta, back to you. This sort of lends really well into the systems-based approach.
Yeah, thanks so much. And this, of course, has been influenced by Brenner, who talked about the systems of influence that we have. And so at the center of this model is the individual. And the individual is obviously impacted by their immediate environment. And so that's called the microsystem. And an immediate environment might be family, home, neighborhood, school, workplace, and anything that is impacting that individual kind of on a day-to-day basis. Then the lighter blue circle, so if we skip the orange one for a second and go to the lighter blue one, those are more the informal and formal social structures. So that might be the sector that somebody works in. That might be the community groups that impact them. It might be whether or not they're eligible for employment insurance or health benefits or those kinds of things. So we're all impacted by formal structures. And then that orange line in the middle is the interaction between the immediate and the more formal and informal structures. So an interaction might be, for example, that I'm under my spouse's medical plan. And if my spouse loses his job, then I don't have a medical plan anymore. So there's an interaction. The systems aren't static, they're dynamic, and there's movement between those systems. Further out, the green ring is the cultural and the social elements. So we're influenced by being in Canada, if that's where we're calling in from today, we're influenced by our provincial legislation. We're influenced by what's going on globally in the world and our ability to, move throughout parts of the world. And then beyond that is the chrono system, or the changes that happen over time. So as we know from Indigenous teaching, they talk about the importance of seven generations, that what has happened to our ancestors is influencing us today and is going to continue to influence the generations that follow. And so changes over time have definitely greatly impacted us. So from a systems approach, when we look at the diversity disconnect, then we need to pay attention not just to the individuals that we serve, but we need to pay attention to the individuals within their context, with systems of support. And so when we start to look at policy, for example, systemically, then interactions that are going on. Of course, every policy maker, everyone that writes policy, is also an individual that is impacted by all of these systems. Every service provider, I'm seeing a sign that sound quality is getting poorer, and so I think my internet is unstable. So I'll hand it back to Cassie for a moment, and we can move on.
Thanks, Roberta. Yeah, I think your point came across that essentially, like when we're thinking of a systems-based approach, traditionally we've put an individual like job seeker in the middle, and that's what we've looked at. But a career development practitioner is also in the middle of this system. People who are working in public service are also in the middle of this system and subject to all the influences that everyone else is as well. And that really brings us to our first recommendation, is about getting real about this shared understanding through a holistic systems-based exploration of experiences. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to introduce a few of those models. And I want to bring Janet in here as we get started looking at these recommendations, because I wanted to get, Janet, your thoughts on, as part of this call for a systems-based approach, what do career practitioners, employers, and other community service providers, what do they need to know about the reality of public service work?
Thank you, Cassie. Yeah, I think the first thing to recognize is our public servants who we work with on funding contracts and on programs want the same things that we want. They want to see the clients that we serve, the economies that we are a part of thrive, and that we're all working in this together, but sometimes we forget. And I think that that's important. We also have to keep in mind that as difficult it is as it is to work within a system of employment services or within employment in general, it's also very difficult to work within the public service, because there are processes and structures that are set up, as well as a political cycle that determines which direction the funding and the programs are going to go in. And I think sometimes when we're working with our funders, and we forget that the people that we're working with want the same things we want and are also working within a structure that is quite difficult to navigate.
Thanks, Janet. Yeah, that is a really important thing. I'm going to jump ahead just one slide before I bring Roberta in as well. But I had gone out and just done a quick summary of the headlines for the reality of the Canadian public service. And just as you were talking about that cycle, that political cycle that's going through, you can see here, these are headlines that I pulled out from 2024 to 2025 that sort of came around that election cycle. And I'm going to pull our attention to the middle one there. No matter who wins this federal election, the government employees will need to be prepared for cuts. And so that's just the reality that we're living in right now. And this specifically refers to the federal government, but I invite, everyone who's here today, maybe after the session, to take a look, what funding pockets are you involved in, and, whether they're provincial or territorial or federal, what is the impact that's happening there? What's going on? What is the context for those contracts for you? So Roberta, the question I had for you was specifically around this notion of servant leadership. So Janet talked a little bit about, we're all trying to do the best that we can. We're all trying to help people. So this notion of servant leadership really fits with what she started talking about. Could you provide us a little more detail on that?
Yeah, I think that for any of you that heard our new Prime Minister's acceptance speech, he really talked about that as well. That he was there. His wife actually spoke and said when she first met him, he said, I'm going back to Canada to serve. That I have that need to serve the public. And so a lot of times we don't think about public service as servant leadership, but I think that any of the folks I've met, and I began my career working in both the provincial and the federal governments, the notion was to help. Like that's what motivated people to do that kind of work for the most part. I mean, obviously there's people in a variety of jobs for a variety of reasons, but most people really are there to help, as Janet said. But there are constraints. They have less flexibility in how they help than I do as the owner of a company. So Cassie, that if we need something at Life Strategies, you come to me and we'll make the decision together about whether we need it, and I'll put it on Visa or write the check and it's done. It doesn't work that way in large organizations, in any bureaucracies. It doesn't work that way at the university, and it doesn't work that way in public service. So as much as somebody might want to help, we have to help them do their job. And we have to help them do their job by asking for things in the way that they're able to offer us the help that they need. So I think when we recognize that we're all working toward the same goal, then it's taking the time to understand the complexity of systems that allow people to show that service mentality that has drawn them into public service work.
Thanks, Roberta.
So Cassie, I think you're going to move on now to the next recommendation.
Yeah, so I know that we focused a little about the barriers, how difficult it is within public service and trying to be realistic about that. And as our second recommendation was making it personal, this reflection about making manageable and meaningful shifts, we also don't want to be too focused on the negative. And actually, in many of the conversations that we as a team had behind the scenes as we were building this session, not just this particular one, but the whole series out, Yves actually was inviting us to ensure that we were taking a strength-based approach, not just necessarily talking about the barriers and how to handle those, but also looking towards assets and opportunities. So I'd love to have some of your thoughts on that, Yves, as you challenged us to stay a little more positive.
Well, thank you. Happy also to piggyback on the idea that, people who are in public service are there for service, and we have a lot more in common with them than we think we do. So maybe a couple of things to consider is the strengths of our sector, right? So we're the best positioned to know the unique strengths of our clients, that, what makes them, great potential employees. So we're in a unique position in that way. We're the best voice for that. Quite often, if we're working in the sector, we also have, work very hard to develop relationships with multiple employers. So we're actually good at navigating different systems and different barriers and different contexts and whatnot. So we're actually pretty good about that. And guess what? We're also the best position to know what works and what doesn't quite work as well as it should work. Right? So we're uniquely positioned to know that. And not only that, but the reason we know that is we're at the front line. And so the evidence we have on that is based on the experience of our clients. So, we actually bring evidence-based information to the conversation. Sadly, the conversation is more often on the negative side and on the barriers and the problems and all that. And we forget that maybe we can bring some of those solutions to people in government, people who are responsible for programs, people who are responsible for making policy decisions, and sometimes even, decision makers and policy makers and elected officials. And the best way to make that happen is to also work on that side of the relationships. Some of us already do have relationships with the people who are responsible for programs. Some of us may have relationships with local elected officials and whatnot, but we don't always think in ways of leveraging those as constructive and opportunity relationships. So how often or how well do you keep those people informed about, what you learn as a result of solving a problem and for one of your clients, what you're learning in terms of improving your own programs, and how well are you sharing the knowledge that you're developing from your clients to them beyond just putting in a report for a grant you got, right? So this needs to be an ongoing relationship perspective on it. So when we say make it personal, sometimes we forget that the people on that decision-making side of it are also persons, and they also have personal perspectives in this. And as was said before, most of the time their desires to improve things, and you can be actually a source of solutions for them as opposed to being, someone who just brings problems to them and just brings challenges to them. Maybe there's a way to work together on a different way of looking at solutions. So bringing your ideas is very critical and very important in that. And your ideas are more powerful, again, because they're based on the personas, on the persons who are using your programs and having success and breaking through barriers, not just encountering them. So anyways, again, just my 5 cents worth in terms of shifting a little bit the perspective on this and the power we have that we may not always be leveraging as much as we could.
I feel your passion for it as you speak about it. And it makes me reflect on how we often, if we're providing services for clients directly, we often have these conversations with them about staying focused on the opportunities and coming with solutions. And yet, sometimes when we're trying to overcome barriers, we focus so much on the barriers and we're not there. We talk a lot about building a vision for the future, and in this companion resource that we built based off the research, we introduced these terms like hope, optimism, and a growth mindset, and use what you shared speaks to many of these elements as well. But I thought I'd also bring in Roberta's perspective here about, the importance of these aspects when we're thinking about a vision, a personal vision for the future.
Yeah, it's really important for us as career development practitioners to remain hopeful and optimistic, and to be committed to growing ourselves. In my doctoral research many years ago now, optimism, out of all the factors I put in to examine, which are many that we knew were important in career development, optimism was the single best predictor of both career success and job satisfaction. So we can apply this to our own jobs, that if we are optimistic about what we do, we're optimistic about the future for our clients, then we are more likely to be satisfied at work and to be successful at work. The same is true for our clients. But if we're really focused on negativity and all of the headlines like, oh my gosh, it's hard to turn on your computer now without getting negative headlines in your news feed, and so you get distracted with that on your way to the website that you're trying to open or the research that you're trying to do. So we need to find ways like this webinar series of surrounding ourselves with positive people who can help us find our way through the maze to be more hopeful about the future. Hope is the center of hope action theory. So some of you will be familiar with that, with work from Norm Amundsen and Spencer Niles and Jun Yoon. I co-authored a couple of books with them using career flow as a metaphor, but where hope is at the center of the model. And if we can reinforce hope or instill hope or ignite hope in our clients and in ourselves, then that's similar to optimism, isn't it? That it will predict, it will contribute to their career success and their job satisfaction. The notion of a growth mindset also keeps us focused on positivity, on where we can do better in the future, how we can make the world a better place, and that ripple effect of doing small things, random acts of kindness that spill out and make the world a better place. So when we are focused on challenges, as we need to be, then we need to take that focus and advocate, use it for advocacy. As Eve mentioned, having relationships with our funders, being able to share the stories of what's going on without breaching confidentiality, building composites, sharing vignettes, sharing examples of the kinds of things that our clients are facing can help us together to build a brighter future for everybody. So Cassie, back to you.
We want you to consider what's possible. So what's possible for you in your role, in your context, for the workplaces in your area, in your community, and the community members from your community. And then within that current context, we want you to identify what's driving you forward. So those positive things, but also what's holding you back.